wanted to give a few thoughts. Just had my hair cut, by the way. Looking a bit cool. I want to give a few thoughts on the talk, Mythicist Milwaukee talk. I think it's the final talk, actually. It's between Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, and Richard Carrier. And I've only watched the first 34 minutes, let me just say that, right? Which is why it's on this channel here, because then I feel like I'm immune to the criticism of you should have watched the whole thing twice and made a series of notes, blah, blah, blah. I just want to give my thoughts on what I've seen so far, which has been a bit frustrating in some ways. And I want to talk about how I view the contributions of both of them so far. But first, just let me say that a definition was given for social justice, and it wasn't a bad definition, and it relied upon discrimination as its basis and the tackling of discrimination. But what it didn't tackle was the fact that you can take what seems like a fairly straightforward definition and assume it leads to a certain set of positions, whereas in actual fact that really isn't the case. There's a whole slew of different positions that you could take and regard as social justice, very different positions, and that actually a lot of people quite far on the right of politics could legitimately, logically describe some of their positions as social justice positions. I've discussed some of these in the past and the different ways that people suggest that certain things amount to social justice or don't, and the different counter arguments you can have with regard to that. Even with something as simple as tax, you know, you could make a case that a poll tax is fair, that is justice, everybody's paying the same. That's a logical, coherent argument. You could make the claim that a flat rate of tax where your marginal rate is the same as your average rate, and that is fair because everybody's paying the same rate. You can make a case that a progressive rate, such as we see in I think every Western country, where your marginal rate is higher than your average rate, that is fair because the people who can pay more pay more. I actually don't think fairness and justice enters into what we actually do. Practical matters enter into it, really, and we need to raise so much revenue to do the things that we do, and so that's what we do. And if we didn't do it that way, probably the vast majority of people would start rioting in their own self-interest, their own selfish interests, really. So it doesn't really, what we actually do has less to do with fairness and justice and more to do with the practical realities of it. But you could make a social justice case for all of them. That's the point that I'm making. So we're dealing with something which is far more amorphous than it would seem from this discussion. Listening to the discussion, I have to say so far, I'm more impressed with the contribution of Carrier than I am of Benjamin. And I say that not because I agree with everything that Richard Carrier says. I think that Sargon is right, that Carrier is underplaying the influence that some of these people have, albeit I think Benjamin overplays numerically how great they are. I think this is a very vocal, raucous minority, but a minority that punches above their size, because I think that is the nature of things. The nature, especially of social media, is that it is possible to be very coercive and manipulative, and this is a group of people who think they're doing that with the sort of righteousness held firmly aloft, which is a powerful thing within itself, as you can see within religions. Actually, small minorities acting, feeling they've got that sort of righteousness, can be a very, very powerful and effective tool, even in the face of a larger number of moderates. So I think that Carrier is wrong in underplaying that. I think he's probably right numerically, and he kind of got badgered away from that in saying that his position is a minority position. I'm not sure that that's true, because I think if you look at online politics, it sort of looks like this sort of thing, with it skewed to the highly polarized ends. Politics isn't like that. Politics is more like a sort of normal distribution curve. But that middle, that hump in the middle, the fucking centrist scum that everybody can't stand, right, is grossly underrepresented online, both numerically in some ways, but also I think in terms of influence. People just don't care. They want to hear, if you're just to the left of that, let's hear the fucking extreme left. If you're just to the right of that, let's cheer for that. Because it's less messy. It's less complicated, right? People aren't giving a message where there is a bit of this and there is a bit of truth to that. which people don't want to hear, I don't think, online. They want to hear people fucking shouting and getting angry about it all. So it tends to portray a very unrealistic circumstance, I think. I mean, I watch videos by people like Christy Winters was mentioned there. She's as nutty as a fucking box of frogs. She's hardly got a redeeming characteristic to her, and yet I watch her hangouts with Kevin Logan because the fact that she's extreme makes it more interesting, I suppose, for me to watch. Right, and I've got to say that, and I'm kind of a little bit ashamed of myself of that, but that is the way that it goes. I was listening to Andy Warski slagging off Blair White. I watched about an hour. I had enough after about an hour. But I was on my bike the other day. Another fucking extreme twat in the things that he says, quite honestly. He says things just to wind people up, to try and cause controversy. Does that all the time. But there's something sort of... There's something alluring about listening to that kind of crap. So... it's a difficult situation. But what I found was, listening to this, to be truthful, is as I listened to this... I heard Richard Carrier as somebody trying to assess the issues and saying, look, there are issues here, and I can't hold my hand up and say that I represent all of social justice, or certainly not these real warriorists, but we need to try and find a path through this. And what I heard was Carl Benjamin smashing his fist on the table in a way that I don't know what it added, really. I understood maybe a little bit of his frustration that, no, the problem is worse than you're portraying, Carrier. But at the same extent, it's a little bit... It makes me want to say, well, so what do you propose then? Because these people aren't going to go away. And they're not going to shut up. And none of us would want to shut them up, right? Because that's not the way, that's not the rules, that's not the way that we roll, is it? So where do we go from there? And it reminds me of the sort of situation where people will talk about Islam and moderate Muslims and sneering at that, you know, as opposed to trying to uplift moderate Muslims. And in the case of moderate Muslims, in many cases, depends what the subject you're talking about is, but even in the West, on some subjects, they are the exception. They are in the minority when it comes to some particular issues. So... It isn't necessarily an easy job, but what is the alternative? Banging your fists on the table won't make people abandon Islam or become more moderate, and it won't make them shut up. And it's the same thing here. It isn't going to shut these cunts up, is it? It's not going to do that at all. So I think for me, what I'm frustrated at, I'm 34 minutes in, and what I would hope for is maybe what would have been more productive would have been a bit more of a discussion of, okay, how do we create a situation where, I'm saying the Richard Carriers of this world. Richard Carrier seems somewhat reinvented from a few years ago, but maybe I was labouring under a misconception of what he was actually like. But the Richard Carriers as we're perceiving him here, the Richard Carriers of this world, how do we go about increasing our engagements with them? And I say our engagements with them, I think on a lot of issues I'm not that far away. So it might also be other people's engagements with me, because I regard myself as progressive and in many cases on board with social justice. So how do you go about uplifting that? Right, that would perhaps be a more positive discussion to have, because ultimately... just saying, well, it can't happen presently. Well, what it sounds almost like one of these kind of fucking disputes between the fucking Bosnian Kurds and the Bosnian Muslims or something. It just goes on for centuries, and it's just absolutely intractable. When you look at it from the outside, you think, well, ultimately something has to fucking give somewhere. Just being entrenched in your position and saying, well, I'm not going to back down until something else happens, you know. Sargon seems to be saying, well, yeah, that we can't have these discussions. Yeah, we need to discuss these things, but we can't discuss it under the present zeitgeist because none of these things can be discussed, or this can't happen, or that can't happen. And I just don't find that helpful. That's not useful, that, because, well, what's going to happen? How many years do we wait? Do we wait 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? Because these twats aren't going to go away. And actually they're doing pretty well, as in other videos Carl will admit. So what's the answer? I don't think the answer is just to keep banging your fucking fists on the table. And for me, thus far, Carrier seems more willing to engage intellectually on maybe ways that we could try and do some positive things, right, in terms of this. And Sargon doesn't really seem to want to know about that. And that I don't think that's helpful, right? It's like, well, we're not going to do anything because it isn't going to work. It isn't going to work because we aren't going to do anything. So we're just going to keep shouting. Let's just keep fucking shouting at one another. I think just let me give you some positive things, actually. Because one thing that Carl talked about was the way that Christy Winters had tried to disrupt this event that she's never going to go to. She's no interest in going to. But she's going to try and do it anyway with a sort of endless series of smear campaigns because she's a weird obsessive and quite frankly that she's got nothing fucking better to do, clearly, with the time, right? But what is interesting is, I propose to you, if you went back 2 or 3 years, there were a lot more people who were willing to listen to a Christy Winters or a Steve Shives or any one of these other people, right? Willing to listen to them and take what they said seriously. And now, when they're doing these same things, everybody knows, it's that crackpot, right? It doesn't matter. They're just disregarded, actually, by most people now. And so I think there is becoming that point of differentiation between these people that are maybe good to watch, good value to watch, but are fringe people who have a very, very myopic, narrow perspective on what is a very puritanical perspective on their social justice issues, actually. And actually falling out with a lot of people that they were friends with, right? There's like the fucking onion and the fucking layers are coming off and they're pretty much all that's left now. There is becoming a greater degree of differentiation between them and the more moderates, where there wasn't back in 2013, 2012, 2013, 2014, certainly. And that some of those that you would have had in that camp now aren't in that camp anymore because they've seen that a degree of differentiation needs to be made between them as moderates and they can see the extremism of some of the people that they were actually chumming up to at that point. Okay, I think that's pretty much got off my chest what I wanted to say.